The Lord be with you. The Lord be with you. Welcome everybody. Welcome to this sacred space of St. Peter's Cathedral. This gathering has been a very long time coming, and it's wonderful to see so many here and all ready to have a great evening. One of the great joys has been seeing our catering team have not forgotten their skills. Lovely. My task tonight is very simple, is to introduce you to the MC for the evening, Dr. Angela Evans.
Well, thank you, Frank, and good evening, everyone. It is a real treat, I think, to welcome you here tonight and to be Jenny's MC for this auspicious occasion. Thank you, Jenny, for the honour. And I was actually just thinking as I was driving here tonight that I think it must be fairly close to 20 years, Jenny, that I've known you from our days at St Oswald's at Parkside. And just as I saw Lucy tonight, I was thinking she was about this high, and Harriet was even shorter. And if Harriet's online, hello, in Sydney. But you know, they were little girls in floral dresses. You were a maths teacher at that stage, so it's been quite a time. Jenny Wilson, indisputably, is a logophile, a lover of words. She's a sermoniser and an author, having written her first book from this place, I think in 2011, and it was called About Life. And in a way that sums up a lot about Jenny, sort of the real and groundedness of her ministry and herself. As well as that, she's a Brit by birth and an Adelaidean by luck, hers and ours. And as well as words, Jenny also likes birds, puffins, butchooks, and given what we're here for tonight, I think the now eponymous Kingfisher will rate a mention as well. But amid and through her words, and sometimes birds, Jenny loves God. And here, in a place so much a part of our city fabric and culture, Gothic in its style and richly filled now with over 150 years of prayers and preaching and incense on all number of occasions, and resting, of course, on the lands of the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains. Here, Jenny brings words, some about birds, and tells stories about God. Tonight there will be many words of all sorts. And to begin, we have some that Jenny actually heard sung in York's Minster a few years ago. The Shepherd Carol was composed by Bob Chilcott. And as reported in the Telegraph in London, John Rutter is quoted as saying, "For my money, this is the most beautiful modern carol there is." The Cathedral Choir, under the direction of Anthony Hunt, will sing it for us now. right. So from words sung to words enacted and or recited. The Independent Theatre Company, which celebrated its anniversary of 35 years last year, is no stranger to this place, to St Peter's Cathedral. In fact, the directors, Rob Croser and David Roach, met in a play in the cathedral in 1978. How can that be when you both look 29? Rob and David have directed many plays in the cathedral, and the most recent being when Dean Frank invited Rob to be a member of the cathedral chapter about 5 years ago. Since that time, Independent Theatre have performed in a memorial for the centenary of the Anzac Landing, in a service for United Nations Peace Day, and in an incredible performance honouring the life and work of William Shakespeare, entitled The Mirror Up to Nature, performed in the empty cathedral to raise funds for the organ restoration project. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Rob Croser and David Roach to give a short glimpse into the second chapter of Jenny's book, which is entitled Novels, Windows on the Soul. Would you please welcome Rob and David?
In the second chapter of Jenny's book, she spends time reflecting on 4 of her favourite novels, finding there some ideas about God. In the first sermon, exploring ideas of grace and goodness, Jenny looks at the book dearly loved by her sister Sarah, Middlemarch by George Eliot. In the novel, George Eliot explores the life of a fictional town, Middlemarch, set in provincial England in the early part of the 19th century. The novel involves a rich tapestry of characters, at its heart focusing upon 2. And these 2 characters are Dorothea Brooke, who grew up in Middlemarch, and Tertius Lidgett, a doctor who comes to work in the town as the novel opens. George Eliot's portrayal of these 2 characters are 2 powerful depictions of defeated aspiration. They both long to have lives characterised by grace and goodness, to leave some reforming, blessing legacy. Both fail. George Eliot's reflections at the opening and close of her novel are the passages Jenny explores in her sermon. Middlemarch opens with some thoughts on the life of St. Teresa.
Teresa's passionate nature demanded an epic life. Her flame, fed from within, soared after some illimitable satisfaction, some object which would never justify weariness, which would satisfy self-despair with a rapturous consciousness of life beyond self. She found her epos in the reforming of a religious order.
St. Teresa found her epos, her great life's work. George Eliot's own key characters, Dorothea Brooke and Tertius Lidgett, dream of such a life, such a work, and yet they are defeated. The reader of Middlemarch is prepared to encounter such defeat right at the beginning of the book, in the final words of the prelude.
Here and there, a cygnet is read uneasily among the ducklings in the brown pond, and never finds the stream in fellowship with its own hoary-footed kind. Here and there is born a Saint Teresa, foundress of nothing, whose loving heart beats and sobs after an unattained goodness tremble off and are dispersed among hindrances instead of centering in some long recognisable deed.
Jenny's sermon closes with a reflection on the conclusion of Middlemarch, a chapter entitled Finale. In this chapter, the author sums up the lives of her characters in order that the reader may say farewell. Dr. Lidgett, she tells that reader, dies early, viewing his life a disappointment. Dorothea, though released from a marriage that imprisoned her and found entering a marriage that was more life-giving, is described as having felt that there was always something better which she might have done, if only she had been better and known better. George Eliot does not leave her reader with her character's pronouncement of disappointment on their lives. Disappointment does not have the final say. Eliot writes a little more of her daughter in literature, Dorothea.
Her finely touched spirit had still its fine issues, though they were not widely visible. Her full nature, like a river, spent its time in channels which had no great name on earth. But the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive, for the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so well with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs.
And Jenny concludes,
this is the key, the hope. This is redemption, really. George Eliot names it. This is where grace and goodness touch the world, in the lives of ordinary people who rest, as George Eliot writes, in unvisited tombs. Another of Jenny's favourite novels is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Set in the sleepy Alabama town of Macon at the time of the Great Depression, To Kill a Mockingbird revolves around a trial in which a black man is wrongly accused of raping a white girl. The story is narrated by the adult Jean Louise Finch, remembering herself as the 8-year-old scout who lives with her brother Jem and their widowed father Atticus. It is Atticus who will defend Tom Robinson, the man accused of rape. Early in the novel, Scout comes home from school, raging about the injustices meted out by her sister, Miss Caroline. Scout and Miss Caroline's first day at school has not gone well. Scout, a prolific reader, has arrived at school, and her teacher, Miss Caroline, has instructed Scout that her father Atticus is not a teacher anymore, as it will interfere with her reading. This is not the limit of Miss Caroline's misdemeanours. At lunchtime, Miss Caroline accuses one of her other students, Walter Cunningham, of forgetting his lunch.
"Did you forget your lunch this morning?" asked Miss Caroline. Walter looked straight ahead. I saw a muscle jump in his skinny jaw. "Did you forget it this morning?" asked Miss Caroline. Walter's jaw twitched again. "Yebba," he finally mumbled. Miss Caroline went to her desk and opened her purse. "Here's a quarter," she said to Walter. "No, thank you, ma'am," he drawled softly. Impatience crept into Miss Caroline's voice. "Here, Walter, come and get it." Walter shook his head again. When Walter shook his head a third time, someone whispered a third time, "Go on, tell her, Scout." I rose graciously on Walter's behalf. Miss Caroline. Miss Caroline, he's a Cunningham." I sat back down. "What, Jean Louise?" I thought I had made things sufficiently clear. It was clear enough to the rest of us. Walter Cunningham was sitting there, lying his head off. He didn't forget his lunch. He didn't have any. He had none today, nor would he have any tomorrow or the next day. He had probably never seen 3 quarters together at the same time in his life.
Arriving home, Scarlett has decided that she won't go to school anymore if it is all right with Atticus. He asks what the matter is.
Bit by bit, I told him the day's misfortunes, and he said, "You taught me all wrong, so we can't ever read anymore, ever. Please don't send me back, please, sir." Atticus walked to the end of the porch. When he had completed his examination of the wisteria vine, he strolled back to me. "First of all," he said to me, "if you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get on better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around him." Atticus said I had learned many things today, and Miss Caroline had learned many things herself. She had learnt not to hand something to a Cunningham. But if Walter and I had put ourselves in her shoes, we'd have seen it was an honest mistake on her part.
You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb to his skin and walk around in it, until you put yourself in their shoes. Atticus' plea for Scout is woven through layer after layer of this wonderful book. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. Don't judge the black man, Tom Robinson, who is on trial. Don't judge the hidden neighbour, Boo Radley, who terrifies you because all you know of him is the frightening stories people have told you. Don't judge the grumpy old lady across the road, Mrs. DeBose. And don't even judge your teacher. Every strangeness has a story. Don't judge a person until you've stood in their shoes. Jenny's sermon concludes,
Well, that is just what God did, you see. Just what God did in the Incarnation, if you want to use a technical religious term. God climbed into our skins and walked around in them. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth, as John's Gospel says. God embraced our point of view. God was born on this earth and lived a human life. And God died a human death. And so, we know as we prepare to walk with him this Holy Week, the one who created us and redeemed us has walked in our shoes.
Oh, thank you, Rob and David. I wanted you to keep going. I was just getting into that. Thank you, that was wonderful. And as you can hear the words coming through, Jenny loves words, loves literature, as is been evident from that wonderful performance from Rob and David. But she's also long been fond of numbers. As I mentioned earlier, as a former maths teacher, Jenny once lived in a world where she dealt with, and I was struggling here, Jenny, but equations and derivations and proofs before changing horses, as it were, and being ordained to the diaconate and then to the priesthood. It occurred to me what a remarkable journey that is, and it also occurred to me that we could say you've shifted from bodmass to godmass. and yet you're still dealing with symbols, but in a different way and in a different space. Now these symbols are based on parable and story, literature, lived in community and full of faith. And now some words of launch. It is a great pleasure to welcome our Primate, Archbishop of Adelaide, Geoff Smith, who actually has his own set of numbers as the 10th Bishop and 5th Archbishop of Adelaide, to add his words and to officially launch Jenny's book. Thank you, Geoff.
Thanks, Angela. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight, finally, to celebrate Jenny's book of sermons. It's a pleasure because it's great to see people of the diocese writing books, and it's a great pleasure for me because I really appreciate good sermons and good preaching. Rosalind Brown, in the introduction of her 2011 book on preaching called Can Words Express Our Wonder, says this: God has given us good news to share. The privilege of preaching is immense. The potential impact of preaching is life-changing. The need for preaching is undiminished. And the wonder is that we are called to share in this ministry. Those words, I think, sum up the importance of preaching really well. While we may use many tools in the process of communicating the good news of God's vision for the world, the sermon continues to have an important role, especially as we gather for worship. The Holy Spirit continues to speak to the hearts of people who preach and hear sermons. Not always, I'd have to say, quite the way the preacher might have intended. I'm sure I'm not alone in reflecting that sometimes people come out of church and comment on the sermon, and I wonder whether they've been in the same church I have. I've even had someone come out of church and congratulate me on the sermon my colleague had preached. The process of God communicating through sermons is a bit of a mystery, but communicate God does. Sermons are not always universally appreciated though. Sermons kind of have a general reputation for being long and boring. There are lots of jokes about sermons that focus on this theme, like this one, for instance. A priest known for his lengthy sermons noticed a man get up and leave during the middle of his message. The man returned just before the conclusion of the service. Afterwards, the priest asked the man where he had gone. "I went to get a haircut," was the reply. "But," said the priest, "why didn't you do that before the service?" "Because," the gentleman said, "I didn't need one then." Sermons, of course, don't have to be long or boring. They certainly shouldn't be boring, and if a sermon is engaging, we tend not to notice how long it is anyway. One of the issues, I think, is that I don't think preaching gets the focus it deserves. At the more Catholic end of the church, the popular view is that it's the sacraments that count, and people just endure the sermon. The trouble is that can become a cycle, where the preacher doesn't think the people value the preaching, so the preacher doesn't put much effort into their preparation, and the sermon isn't much good, and the listeners don't appreciate the sermon, and so around and around we go. Those of us who preach need to work to break that cycle. The best way to do that is to make good, well-prayed through preaching a priority. Remember Rosalind Brown's words: the potential impact of preaching is life-changing. As preachers, we need to seek to cooperate with God so that the Holy Spirit can touch hearts. Jenny shares this enthusiasm for preaching, and one of the good things that she has done, apart from this book, is to, with others, start the Company of Preachers as a way to encourage preachers in their craft. Preaching and good preaching is really important, and good preaching needs to be encouraged. Jenny has also demonstrated her enthusiasm for preaching in the publication of the book that we're launching tonight. Keeping Watch for Kingfishers is a collection of collections of sermons. 6 collections of sermons with 33 sermons in total. The first collection is focused on prayer, and the first of those introduces us to the Kingfisher on the cover of the book. There are 2 parts this Kingfisher plays in the reflection on prayer. First, the Kingfisher's love and devotion to its young, which sees it spending all day searching for food in the middle of a monsoonal downpour, which is why the bird on the cover of the book is looking a bit bedraggled. And the second is the process of photographing the Kingfisher, watching and waiting for the flash of colour and movement, being there, ready for what might come as an understanding of prayer. I think that's actually a fantastic image for the experience of prayer. It reminds me of the poem Folktale by R.S. Thomas. It's a short little poem. It goes like this. Prayers like gravel flung at the sky's window, hoping to attract the loved one's attention. But without visible plats to let down for the believer to climb up, to what purpose open that casement? I would have refrained long since, but that peering once through my locked fingers, I thought I detected the movement of a curtain. That same sense of waiting and watching, even for the slightest movement or the flash of colour. The movement of God, the inspiration of God, God breaking into our reality. This is a really great sermon to start the collection. I think it's actually my favourite of the collection. There are 4 sermons on prayer in the first collection, then 4 based on some of Jenny's favourite novels, as we've heard. They are followed by 6 sermons looking at Jesus' encounters with people, then 4 sermons for particular festivals and days of focus, then 5 from the Gospel of Luke, and finally 10 sermons looking at the story of Jesus moving through Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter and Pentecost. As they say, there is something here for everyone. The sermons are clearly contextual. The choir and the cathedral get lots of mentions. Lots of mentions. Jenny's style as a preacher comes through very clearly. In some ways, these sermons are like reflections, encouraging the hearer or the reader to reflect on the God stories that they point to. The sermons are very biblical, not expository, but seeking to engage and illuminate the scriptures. Even the sermons using Jenny's favourite novels as a focus are like this. They seek to reflect God in a contemporary way. One of the stylistic features of the sermons is that they include quotes, not just from the scriptures, but also from scholars and poets. We can see who Jenny's favourite authors are by the number of times they appear in the sermons. People like Rowan Williams, Walter Brueggemann, Brendan Byrne and Michael Main, just to name a few. I've never been convinced of the value of significant quotes in sermons or speeches generally. The wisdom which is quoted is too quickly overtaken by the preacher's next words and therefore too easily lost. That's why, even though these sermons were written to be heard, I think a great deal of their value is to be gained by reading them and reflecting on them. That's why it's really good that the collection's been published, so we can sit with these thoughts and discover more of God's word for us. There are some great reflections in the sermons. For instance, we belong in a world that celebrates Christmas and yet doesn't. How simple and profound. That's worth thinking about. Or this one. Healing stories are Exodus stories, really. They involve God freeing a person or a people who are enslaved in some way by illness. An illness that traps them away from home. And finally, from the very last page, the key thing is that this life of ours belongs in the great story of God, in which all our stories find their home. I really enjoyed reading Jenny's book of sermons twice. First time for the first launch. Unfortunately, I thought after the first launch was cancelled that there wouldn't be a launch, so I disposed of all my notes. But it was actually worth reading the book a second time. I think I picked up some things I hadn't seen before. That's a bit like sermons, really, isn't it? The sermons are worth reflecting on as we seek to know and love God and realise just how much God loves us. Thank you, Junie, for your commitment to preaching. Thank you to those who convinced you to allow a collection to be collected. I hereby declare the book officially launched.
Thank you, Archbishop Geoff. Some wonderful insights, and oh, the cost of a tidy desk. And now, by way of response, it's your turn to call author, as we ask Jenny to come and reply.
This is just a string of thank yous, really, but here we go. First of all, Archbishop Geoff, it is truly an honour for me and for the Dean and for this community that you have launched our book. So, thank you. Thank you, Dean Frank, for your welcome. Thank you, Angela. Angela Evans has AM after her name. Where is she? Oh, you're there. She's ready she's got a task, but you just wait, Angela. Angela has AM after her name for very good reason. She is passionate, devoted, and if you know something of her life story and her work in places that are very poor, incredibly courageous in what she's done to heal the feet of people across the world, to name just one thing. AM belongs by her name. She is a dear friend to our family and this community, and thank you so much for holding us together. Be reassured, I think she has a deal with Ant that if I talk too long, she'll wave at him, he'll wave at the choir, and they'll start singing. So this will not go on forever. Thank you to Meredith and the hospitality team. To meet with Meredith and Pauline and Francis the other day, to dust off the wine glasses and the tablecloths and to think, yes, this is how we do this, has been such a joy. And quite honestly, I don't think they'd have cared what we were celebrating. How good to be together and celebrate. Thank you, Pauline, and the bar team. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you to Jim and the shop committee for believing in this book. I don't suppose they had a choice but to buy 250 copies, but they did, and I know they'd love it if they were sold. But thank you, Jim. Thank you to Gerald and the stewards for holding us together, for Rachel for her wonderful organisation and calm presence. And now to our entertainers. Rob and David are dear friends, again of our family and of this community, and to hear the story that they met here just makes it all the more important that they were part of our launch, and thank you both. When I started working here and I stood in that stall and I found myself in the midst of the cathedral choir singing, I knew I'd come to heaven. Thank you to Anthony. Thank you to our choir for your beautiful singing. And now to the book. This little book would not have existed had it not been for two women. Sometimes we know who we are when someone says to us, this is who you are, and this is what you can do. My book exists because of Di Nichols, OAM, and Kathy Teague. Di and Kathy read 4 years' worth of sermons. You only had to read a book twice, Archbishop. Chose the ones they liked, and we ordered them, and then when the ordering didn't work, reordered them, and gave them titles, and gave the book its title. And here we are. We are who we are because of the people who believe in us. Di and Kathy, would you please come forward? Thank you to the editing support team, Dr. Rodney Fopp, Canon Bill Goods, and my sister, a professional editor, Sarah Wilson. And now to the publisher. Heartfelt thanks to Sacristy Press in Durham, UK. I hope they're watching now on the live stream, but I think they'll watch later. This little publishing company was born in 2013. Sacristy Press is run by the publisher Richard Hilton, editor Natalie Watson, formerly of Canterbury Books, ably assisted by marketing expert Eric Sharman. It has been a joy working with them. If you ever want to publish something that's vaguely to do with religion, please send it to Sacristy Press. I've had a lovely time meeting you and working with you. Thank you. Mark Sibley, who is watching with Sarah in quarantine, and I have been fortunate to work as duty chaplains in Westminster Abbey. Knowing him from my time there, I asked former precentor of Westminster Abbey, Christopher Stoltz, if he would write the foreword. I fully expected him to say no, but he said yes. And so, sincere thanks for his generous words. And also to Sydney photographer Offa Levy. Offa Levy's photograph was in a museum exhibition of nature photography, and he kindly allowed us to use the photograph in the book. And now, I have been given the strictest instructions about these words. I have lived in 2 families, with Mum, Dad and my sister, Jane, Trevor and Sarah Wilson, and with Nicholas, Lucy and Harriet Isles. These 6 people who mean the world to me are, particularly in Nicholas's case, a rock for me, my family, are people who care deeply about things, express their care passionately, use words beautifully and powerfully. And if I have ever said anything worth listening to, it is significantly because of this family and the clergy who since my childhood I have heard preach, and the church communities in which I have lived and been nurtured. And so we come to my final thank you, church communities, and particularly this church community, the people of St. Peter's Cathedral. The task of a preacher is not to draw attention to themselves, and I've failed utterly in this event. The task of a preacher is to point away from themselves, to point to God, or the hope of God, or the rumour of God. The task of the preacher is to tell the story of God, loving and creating, forgiving and redeeming. And I am sure Frank and our fellow clergy would all express the most profound gratitude to the people of this cathedral, this extraordinary group of people who encourage we preachers, inspire us, look to us, to point to the loving and creating, forgiving and redeeming God. Thank you.
sub-editors, Kathy and Di, hand-picked direct from Inman Valley. Impossible to be any fresher. But I know how much both Di and Kathy have appreciated being involved in the creation of your 2 books, and I'd say in the last decade of your life. So on behalf of Kathy and Di, and probably the whole community of the cathedral, thank you. Well done. We've had them all, haven't we? Written, sung, enacted, spoken, launching, by way of response, with and without flowers. But a few more words from afar. You mentioned the foreword to Keeping Watch for Kingfishers, penned by the precentor of another St Peter's, better known as London's Westminster Abbey. And the Reverend Christopher Stolz, who Jenny just mentioned and who's known to some of us, I contacted him a little while ago in pre-pandemic times and then again. And I won't read the whole email, but just a little paraphrase. And Chris said, Angela, thank you. It was such a privilege writing the introduction to Jenny's lovely book, and it was most kind of her to ask. I am sorry not to be joining you for the launch, and I wish you all the very best for the event, with every good wish to you all. Chris Stolz. So there you are. So having begun with words sung, we are now back full circle to hear the fantastic cathedral choir once again, and this time to sing the work of Anton Bruckner. The cathedral choir, under the direction of Anthony Hunt, will sing Os Justi. Thank you. thank you to the choir of St Peter's Cathedral. And look, thank you everyone for being here tonight to celebrate this occasion with Jenny. Not many of us have become authors twice. And also for sharing with us the many ways words can be used to reflect God in stories and in life, and that's very much what is offered in Jenny's book, Keeping Watch for Kingfishers. Now, two things to note, please. Finally, if you're feeling a little bit sad now that it's all been so beautiful, but it's all about to be over, don't be. Just buy a couple of Jenny's books over here. You can take it all home with you. And I'm sure Jenny would be pleased to sign as many as she can. Secondly, if you too find the title of chapter 9, I think it is, They Have No Wine, a little alarming, rest assured there's plenty. Thank you, Nicholas. And so, thank you, Meredith, and a little message here that refreshments are still on offer. I beg your pardon? 12 baskets full, all right? So plenty of wine, plenty of food. Please enjoy the refreshments, but please maintain safe physical distancing at all times. Thank you for being here once again. I know you'll enjoy Jenny's book. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you.